The Little Ice Age begins. In the quiet shift of seasons, as the warmth of the medieval sun faded behind grey, unyielding clouds, the world began to chill. But this wasn't the usual passing winter. No, what arrived across Europe between the 14th and 19th centuries was something altogether colder, longer, and crueler. It was what historians now call the Little Ice Age, and it wasn't a singular event, but rather a centuries-long stretch of unusually cold winters and unpredictable weather that would shape every corner of medieval life. Imagine it. The snow arrived earlier each year and lingered long into the spring. Rivers that once flowed freely turned into solid glassy veins of ice. Even the mighty Thames in England froze over completely, more than once. Entire communities that once thrived on seasonal harvests and local trade suddenly found themselves locked in, snowed under, and starving. Farmers watched helplessly as crops failed again and again. With each failed harvest, the cold grew not just outside their wooden homes, but inside their bones and in their fears. This period didn't happen overnight. It crept in gradually. Some scholars say it began as early as the 13th century. Volcanic eruptions around the world threw up massive ash clouds, blocking sunlight for months. Then the sun itself entered a period of lower activity, a phenomenon known as the Maunder minimum. Without the sun's usual warmth, the earth tilted a little deeper into shadow. Peasants didn't know what to call it. They didn't understand sun cycles or volcanic dust. To them, it felt like a curse, a punishment from God or the wrath of nature. Whatever the cause, one thing was certain. Life was about to get much harder. Cold winters meant deep snowdrifts that made travel nearly impossible. Trade routes closed. Inns stayed empty. Inns, after all, depended on travelers, and few dared to venture out into the snow-choked forests and icy roads. For months at a time, people were trapped in their villages, huddling together for warmth, rationing firewood, and praying that spring would come, and come quickly. But spring came later each year. The Little Ice Age wasn't a single frozen moment in time. It was a pattern of chaos, some years warmer, others deadly cold. And that unpredictability made it even more terrifying. You couldn't plan. You couldn't prepare. You could only endure. And enduring, in medieval winters, meant fighting every day for warmth, food, and survival. The struggle to stay warm. Inside the modest stone or timber homes of the Middle Ages, warmth was a luxury. Unlike our insulated walls, central heating, or even thick glass windows, medieval dwellings were drafty, smoky, and often damp. People didn't have furnaces or space heaters. What they had, if they were lucky, was a hearth. A small, open fireplace that might be the only source of heat in the entire house. The fire wasn't just for warmth. It was for light, for cooking, and for keeping spirits up in the long darkness of winter. But firewood wasn't free. Forests were often owned by the nobility or the church, and gathering wood without permission could lead to harsh punishments. So, peasants walked a fine line, gathering dead branches when they could, sneaking small pieces, or paying what little they had for access to bundles of logs. Even then, firewood had to be used wisely. A household might burn only 1 or 2 logs per day. They'd burn them in the evening to warm the house just long enough to fall asleep. During the night, the fire would die out, and the chill would creep back in. To fight the cold, people layered their clothing. They wore wool tunics, cloaks, and fur-lined garments, if they could afford them. They slept under animal skins, huddled close to family members, sometimes even with livestock indoors for warmth. That wasn't an accident. Letting sheep or goats sleep in the same space wasn't just about convenience. It raised the temperature of the room. For those who lived in castles or manors, conditions were a little better, but not much. Stone walls retained cold, and vast halls were hard to heat. Even kings and queens complained of freezing feet and icy drafts. Tapestries were hung not just for beauty but to block cold air from seeping through the walls. Every solution was imperfect, every night a test of patience and resilience. The darkness of medieval winters was both literal and emotional. It sapped strength. It isolated. And worst of all, it promised no relief. Only more snow, more silence, more endless grey. Frozen rivers and lost roads. One of the most haunting images of medieval winters was the transformation of rivers into frozen plains. The Thames in London, the Seine in Paris, even smaller waterways in rural towns, all froze so completely that people could walk across them. In some years, they even held markets and fairs directly on the ice. At first glance, that might sound magical, like a fairy tale. But the reality was far from enchanting. Frozen rivers meant stopped trade. Boats couldn't move goods from one region to another. Fishermen couldn't access their usual catches. Entire economies ground to a halt. Salted fish, a staple of winter food, became scarce. Towns dependent on river trade, like Bruges or Ghent, saw their markets dwindle. And it wasn't just rivers. Roads became impassable. Snowfall in medieval Europe was heavy, and there were no snowplows, no salt trucks. Horses struggled through drifts. Wagons got stuck. Merchants stopped traveling. Pilgrimages were postponed or cancelled. Isolation set in. In small towns, that could mean no fresh food, no contact with the outside world, and no help if something went wrong. Bridges became icy traps. People slipped and fell. In some cases, entire structures collapsed under the weight of snow and ice. Villages were cut off completely. If someone got sick, there was no way to get them to a healer or monastery. If a roof collapsed under snow weight, a sadly common occurrence, there was often no one to help dig survivors out. Winter wasn't just a season, it was a siege. And the frozen rivers and lost roads were part of the enemy's strategy. Nature closed the world in on itself, one icy step at a time. Struggles with food preservation in winter. No refrigeration, just the cold in the medieval world, where technology had not yet gifted humanity with the conveniences of refrigeration. Winter food storage was a constant struggle. People relied almost entirely on the natural cold to preserve their perishables. This might sound sufficient, but the inconsistency of weather conditions and limited indoor cooling options meant spoilage was frequent. The absence of regulated, cold environments made it nearly impossible to control the growth of bacteria or prevent mold, especially when temperatures fluctuated. Often, families would bury food in snow or keep it in cellars dug into the earth. But even these methods could fail if the ground didn't stay cold enough. The unpredictability of climate patterns meant that what was good for one winter might not work the next. The psychological burden of knowing your food supply could go bad at any moment was immense. Preservation was a gamble, and for many, the odds weren't good. Salting everything to death salt was a medieval staple not only for flavor but for survival. With no refrigeration, salting was one of the few ways to preserve meats and some vegetables through the long winters. Unfortunately, this meant that nearly everything tasted overwhelmingly salty. Meat would be soaked in brine or dry salted, which drastically altered its taste and texture. Over time, people's palates became used to the saltiness, but this did not mean they enjoyed it. Worse, overconsumption of salt without sufficient fresh water intake could lead to health issues. Salting also didn't guarantee indefinite preservation. If not done precisely, meats could still rot. It required skill, large quantities of salt, and time. In many parts of Europe, salt was so valuable it was sometimes used as currency. The poor often had to make do with insufficient quantities, leading to more spoilage and higher risk of foodborne illness. Salt preserved food, yes, but it also symbolized the bland, difficult winters. Drying, smoking, and hoping drying and smoking were two other common preservation methods. Families would hang meat or fish above their hearths, where smoke from the fire would slowly dehydrate and cure the food. While this technique added flavor, it was time-consuming and required a constant fire, a luxury not all homes could afford in terms of fuel. Vegetables and herbs were sometimes dried as well, laid out on racks or strings near the ceiling, where warmth and dry air could reach them. However, the effectiveness of these methods depended heavily on weather conditions and the skill of the person doing the curing. A damp winter could ruin a whole season's supply of dried food. Inconsistencies in drying could also leave pockets of moisture, allowing mold or bacteria to flourish unseen. People often had to trust their senses, smell, sight, touch, to judge whether food was safe. It was a stressful and imperfect system, leading to sickness and hunger if things went wrong. The root cellar solution. Root cellars were a medieval innovation that helped people store root vegetables like carrots, turnips, onions, and potatoes once they were introduced from the Americas. Dug into the ground and insulated with straw or leaves, these cellars maintained a cool, humid environment ideal for preserving food. Still, they were not foolproof. Rats and insects often found their way in, and even a single bad vegetable could spoil an entire batch. Rot and mold spread easily in the damp underground air. Despite these challenges, root cellars became essential. Many families depended on them for survival, and losing a root cellar to pests or decay could spell starvation. Some communities shared large root cellars, turning them into communal storage centers, which also meant shared risk. The reliability of the root cellar, though imperfect, marked a turning point in how people managed the long, harsh winters. Fermentation, a risky gamble. Fermentation was another preservation technique, used for everything from cabbage, sauerkraut, to dairy, like cheeses and yogurts, to alcoholic drinks. It offered a way to preserve food and sometimes even enhance its nutritional value. However, it was a tricky, often misunderstood process. Without modern knowledge of microbiology, medieval people followed traditional recipes passed down through generations. When done correctly, fermentation could create safe, tasty, and long-lasting food. When done incorrectly, it could lead to dangerous bacteria and food poisoning. There were no pH meters or sterile equipment. All decisions were based on smell, taste, and sight. Often, one person in a village would gain a reputation as the best fermenter, and others would rely on them to handle the process. The gamble of fermentation reflected the broader risks of winter food preparation. You did your best, hoped for the best, and dealt with the consequences. Beer and ale as safe liquid. Calories with clean water often hard to come by. Especially during winter when snow had to be melted or water sources froze, people turned to beer and ale. These drinks weren't just for merriment. They were liquid calories and a relatively safe way to stay hydrated. Brewing beer or ale involved boiling, which killed many harmful pathogens. These beverages also provided vital carbohydrates. Even children drank small beer, which was very low in alcohol but safer than water. Brewing was a communal and sometimes domestic task, with many households producing their own. Larger towns had brewers who made large batches for the community. During the winter, storing beer became another challenge. Barrels could freeze, and fluctuating temperatures could spoil a brew. Still, beer was a staple of the medieval diet, a lifeline when other foods were scarce or unsafe. Dairy's dilemma. Milk and other dairy products were especially vulnerable in winter. Without refrigeration, milk would spoil within hours unless processed immediately. This led to the widespread practice of turning milk into cheese or butter as quickly as possible. Cheesemaking, in particular, became an essential skill. A well-aged cheese could last for months, even through the entire winter, providing protein and fats when fresh food was scarce. Butter could be salted and stored in cool places. However, winter often meant less feed for cows, goats, and sheep, which reduced milk production. Some communities relied on preserved cheeses made during the summer and fall. For poorer families without access to grazing animals or cheese storage, dairy was a rare luxury. In some places, dairy products all but disappeared from winter meals, contributing to nutritional deficiencies and a monotonous diet. Spoilage and sickness. Despite all their efforts, medieval people often faced food spoilage, especially in late winter when supplies ran low and preservation methods had stretched beyond their limits. Spoiled food could cause severe gastrointestinal illness and even death. Without germ theory or knowledge of bacteria, people did not always understand why they got sick after eating. They attributed illness to bad air or curses, not realizing that moldy bread or improperly cured meat was the culprit. The fear of spoiled food haunted many households. People developed superstitions around preservation, sometimes involving rituals or prayers meant to protect their food. While these practices provided psychological comfort, they did little to prevent actual spoilage. Hunger forced people to eat questionable food, rolling the dice with every bite. Winter wasn't just about surviving the cold. It was about surviving the very food meant to keep you alive. Feeding the family, A constant worry. The burden of feeding a family through winter often fell on women, who had to plan meals with great care, ration supplies, and manage preservation methods. They developed deep knowledge of food storage, but even their expertise couldn't always fight off the challenges of the season. Families had to make hard choices. Do you eat the last of the salted pork now or save it for another storm? Do you risk eating the dried beans with a strange smell or go hungry? Parents often went without so their children could eat. Hunger and malnutrition were common, particularly among the poor. The upper classes fared better, with access to imported goods and greater variety. Still, for most medieval people, the winter months were a period of tension, anxiety, and strategic sacrifice. A cycle of scarcity and ingenuity. Despite all these challenges, medieval people developed remarkable ingenuity in dealing with food scarcity. They adapted to their environment, learned to make the most of what little they had, and passed down knowledge that would eventually inform more advanced preservation techniques. From fermentation to shared root cellars, from smoking meats to brewing ales, these practices laid the groundwork for modern food science. The struggle of preserving food in winter was a testament to human resilience. Every successful meal was a victory against the cold. And while starvation and sickness were ever-present threats, so too was creativity, a quiet defiance in the face of a brutal season. The hardships of winter didn't just test the medieval body, they refined the medieval mind. It was in this crucible of scarcity that many of our earliest preservation traditions were forged. The scarcity of food in winter. The lean months. Medieval winters were often called the lean months because food was in critically short supply. As the growing season ended in late autumn, fresh fruits and vegetables disappeared from tables, replaced by whatever had been preserved. The stockpiles from harvest were expected to last until spring, but spoilage, pests, and poor storage often meant these reserves ran dangerously low. Farmers, peasants, and townsfolk alike faced dwindling food supplies, which forced many to ration carefully. The scarcity was felt most keenly in the coldest, darkest months, January and February, when the cold deepened and the days shortened, making any agricultural activity nearly impossible. The lean months also brought uncertainty. If the previous harvest had been poor due to bad weather or pests, winter food stores would be insufficient to carry a family through the season. This scarcity meant hunger was a constant companion for many, and survival depended on how well families had planned and preserved their food during the warmer months. Preserved food, salting and smoking. Since fresh food was rare in winter, preservation techniques such as salting and smoking were crucial for survival. Salting involved covering meat or fish in salt or brine to draw out moisture and inhibit bacterial growth. Smoking meat over a slow fire both preserved it and added flavor. These techniques allowed medieval families to extend the life of their food, but they came with downsides. Salted and smoked foods were tough, salty, and far from fresh, which contributed to the blandness of winter meals. Moreover, preserving food required access to adequate supplies of salt and wood, resources that weren't always easy to come by, especially for poorer communities. The process itself was time-consuming and had to be done carefully to avoid spoilage. In some regions, salted and smoked meats became staples during winter, offering a rare source of protein when other foods were scarce. These preserved foods were lifelines but were also reminders of the harsh conditions people endured during the colder months. Root cellars and what they stored. Root cellars were a vital medieval innovation in the fight against winter hunger. Dug into hillsides or beneath homes, these cool, damp storage spaces protected root vegetables such as carrots, turnips, parsnips, and onions from freezing temperatures. These vegetables formed the backbone of the winter diet for peasants, providing essential vitamins and calories when other foods were unavailable. Root cellars helped slow the natural decay process but did not completely prevent it. Even well-stored vegetables could spoil or be eaten by rodents. The design of root cellars varied widely, but their function remained the same: to offer a stable environment with minimal temperature fluctuation and enough humidity to keep vegetables firm. The presence and size of a root cellar often reflected a family's wealth and status. While they improved winter survival chances, root cellars were not foolproof, and their contents could be wiped out by a single pest infestation or poor management. Grain shortages and moldy bread. Grain was the medieval staple, and bread was the centerpiece of most meals. However, during winter, grain shortages were common, especially after poor harvests. Grain was stored in granaries, but spoilage could occur due to moisture, pests, or mold. Moldy bread was a frequent problem. Consuming it risked illness, but often people had no choice but to eat it out of desperation. The quality of bread declined over winter, becoming harder and less palatable. Poor families often subsisted on coarse, dark bread made from rye or barley, which was less nutritious than the wheat bread enjoyed by the wealthy. Bread shortages were serious enough to cause social unrest in some towns. When grain was scarce, the price skyrocketed, making it unaffordable for many. This shortage compounded the difficulty of feeding families during winter, increasing reliance on whatever other preserved or stored food was available. The nobles ate better. While peasants struggled with scarcity, the nobility often fared much better during winter. Lords and ladies had access to larger, more diverse food stores, including salted and smoked meats, imported goods, and better preserved grains. They could also afford to stockpile more food and had kitchens staffed with cooks skilled in preservation and preparation techniques. Nobles' diets included venison, game birds, and spices that were rare or unavailable to common folk. Winter feasts, though less frequent than in summer, were still occasions of abundance and celebration among the upper class. This disparity in food availability highlighted the social inequalities of medieval society, where wealth could buy comfort and plenty even in the harshest months, while the poor often went hungry or ate meager, monotonous meals. Hunting wasn't easy. For many, hunting was a vital source of fresh meat during winter, but it was fraught with challenges. The cold, snow-covered forests made tracking animals difficult, and many game species migrated or hibernated. Hunting required skill, time, and access to weapons and dogs, which not everyone possessed. Nobles often reserved hunting rights for themselves, legally restricting peasants from hunting on certain lands. Even when hunting was allowed, success was not guaranteed. The harsh weather could force hunters to spend long hours in freezing conditions with little reward. Game that was caught had to be preserved quickly to avoid spoilage, adding to the difficulty of winter food supply. For many common folk, hunting was more of a desperate gamble than a reliable source of food. Vegetable scarcity. Winter brought a near-complete absence of fresh vegetables. The short growing season and cold soil meant that leafy greens, peas, beans, and other crops were unavailable. People relied heavily on root vegetables stored in cellars or on dried legumes, but the lack of variety made diets dull and nutritionally deficient. This scarcity also contributed to vitamin deficiencies and weakened immune systems. While some hardy crops like cabbage could be fermented to last through winter, these were limited in scope. The scarcity of fresh vegetables added to the monotony of winter meals and was a stark contrast to the abundance of summer and autumn harvests. Starvation and malnutrition. For many medieval people, winter was a season of real hunger and even starvation. Poor harvests, spoilage, and limited preservation meant that food was often insufficient. Malnutrition was common, weakening individuals and making them more susceptible to illness. Children, the elderly, and the sick were especially vulnerable. Historical records frequently mention famines triggered or worsened by harsh winters. Chronic hunger reduced work capacity and morale, creating a vicious cycle of poverty and food insecurity. While not everyone starved outright, many lived with the constant threat of starvation looming over their households during the cold months. Winter feasts were rare. Although medieval culture is often associated with grand feasts, these were generally seasonal events reserved for festivals, religious holidays, or noble celebrations. Winter feasts were especially rare among the lower classes, who lacked the food surplus to indulge in such luxuries. Even among the wealthy, the harshness of winter limited the availability of fresh ingredients and made extravagant meals more difficult to prepare. When winter feasts did occur, they were an important morale boost and a symbol of status. These occasions involved roasted meats, spiced wine, and delicacies not regularly consumed during the rest of the season. For most people, however, winter meant simple, repetitive meals focused on survival rather than celebration. How hunger weakened the population. The scarcity of food in winter had a profound impact on the health and resilience of the medieval population. Chronic hunger and malnutrition weakened immune systems, making people more vulnerable to disease, especially during the harsh winter months when respiratory illnesses spread rapidly. Weakened bodies were less able to work, defend themselves, or recover from injury. Hunger also affected mental well-being, causing stress and despair. These factors combined to lower life expectancy and increase mortality rates in winter. The cyclical nature of seasonal hunger reinforced social inequality, as the poor suffered disproportionately. Despite human resilience, the medieval winter was a brutal season that tested both body and spirit through food scarcity. Disease and sickness in the cold. Cold and flu in the Middle Ages. In medieval times, the arrival of winter brought a sharp rise in illnesses, particularly respiratory infections such as the common cold and influenza. Without modern vaccines or antibiotics, people had little defense against viruses that spread rapidly in close quarters, especially during the long, cold months when families stayed indoors. Cold weather itself was believed to cause illness, as many thought that exposure to chilly drafts or damp conditions weakened the body's humors, leading to sickness. Crowded living conditions, poor ventilation, and inadequate heating made the spread of cold and flu rampant in towns and villages alike. The symptoms, coughing, fever, fatigue, often lingered for weeks, reducing people's ability to work and care for themselves. The flu, in particular, could be deadly for the very young, elderly, and those already weakened by malnutrition or other diseases, contributing significantly to medieval winter mortality rates. How dampness made people ill. Dampness was a pervasive and insidious problem during medieval winters. Homes were often built from stone or wood without insulation, allowing moisture to seep in. Without central heating, fireplaces and stoves provided spot heating, leaving many areas of the home cold and damp. This constant exposure to moisture was believed to aggravate ailments like rheumatism, arthritis, and chest infections. Medieval medical theories linked dampness with imbalances in bodily humors, suggesting it caused cold and wet conditions inside the body that led to illness. Beyond the beliefs, modern science confirms that damp, cold environments can worsen respiratory conditions and increase susceptibility to infections. Moreover, wet clothes and bedding created ideal environments for skin infections and worsened general discomfort during winter. The struggle against dampness was a daily battle for medieval families, contributing significantly to winter sickness. No real medicine. Medieval medicine was rudimentary and largely ineffective by modern standards. Physicians relied heavily on theories from ancient texts rather than empirical evidence. When winter sickness struck, there were few real cures available. Treatments often involved balancing the humors through bloodletting, purging, or the use of herbs, but these could sometimes do more harm than good. Access to trained doctors was limited, especially for the poor, who often relied on local healers or family remedies. Hospitals were rare and usually affiliated with religious institutions, providing basic care but little effective treatment. The absence of antibiotics meant bacterial infections could progress unchecked, and many died from what today would be considered treatable illnesses. During harsh winters, the scarcity of food and the prevalence of illness combined to overwhelm whatever limited medical care existed, making sickness a formidable adversary. The role of herbal remedies. Despite the lack of formal medicine, herbal remedies played a crucial role in medieval attempts to combat winter diseases. Many plants and herbs were used to treat symptoms or boost general health, often prescribed by apothecaries or wise women. Ingredients like garlic, elderberry, mint, and willow bark were common, believed to have warming properties or to cleanse the body of harmful humors. Herbal infusions and poultices were applied for colds, coughs, and fevers. While some of these remedies had mild benefits, such as willow bark's pain-relieving properties, a precursor to aspirin, most were limited in their effectiveness. The knowledge of herbs was passed down through generations and sometimes recorded in early herbals or medical manuscripts. However, the reliance on herbs also meant that treatment varied widely in quality and success, with superstition and anecdotal experience often guiding their use. Nonetheless, herbal remedies were a lifeline for many who faced sickness with few alternatives. What doctors believed. Medieval doctors worked within the framework of humoral theory, believing that health depended on a balance of 4 bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Illnesses, including those worsened by winter, were thought to result from an imbalance of these humors caused by cold, damp weather or poor diet. Doctors sought to restore this balance using methods like bloodletting, purging, and applying hot or cold remedies to the body. They also considered astrology and the position of the stars when diagnosing and treating patients. While some of their observations about symptoms were accurate, the underlying theories were flawed, leading to treatments that were often ineffective or harmful. Doctors' limited understanding of contagion meant they underestimated how diseases spread in cold seasons. Nevertheless, their presence provided some guidance and reassurance to patients, and medical texts were among the few sources of formal knowledge available at the time. Frozen water sources. Winter's freezing temperatures posed additional challenges to health through the contamination of water sources. Wells, rivers, and streams often froze or became difficult to access, forcing people to drink from stagnant pools or less clean sources. This led to increased risk of waterborne diseases such as dysentery, cholera, and other gastrointestinal infections. The lack of proper sanitation and waste disposal exacerbated these risks. Ice could trap contaminants near the surface or concentrate pollutants, making water quality unpredictable. Boiling water was not always practiced, and many people did not understand the connection between dirty water and disease. During severe winters, scarcity of clean water contributed to dehydration and illness, compounding the already dangerous conditions caused by cold and malnutrition. Sick animals and contaminated food. Animals were crucial for food and labor, but in winter, livestock health often declined due to cold stress, poor forage, and cramped conditions. Sick animals could carry diseases that spread to humans through contaminated meat or dairy products. Without refrigeration, fresh meat quickly spoiled in milder winter weather, and preservation methods like salting were imperfect. Consuming spoiled or contaminated food led to outbreaks of food poisoning and other illnesses. The medieval understanding of food safety was minimal, and cross-contamination was common. Additionally, rodents attracted to stored grain and food could spread diseases like the plague. The vulnerability of food supplies to contamination during winter made foodborne illnesses a frequent and dangerous problem, adding another layer of hardship to the season's health challenges. Poor sanitation and winter outbreaks. Sanitation in medieval towns and villages was notoriously poor, with waste often dumped in streets or nearby waterways. During winter, cold weather slowed decomposition but did not reduce contamination risks. The crowded living conditions inside homes and the lack of clean facilities meant diseases could spread quickly. Outbreaks of respiratory and gastrointestinal illnesses were common in winter, especially in urban centers. The winter months also saw increased transmission of epidemic diseases like influenza and, at times, plague. The inability to effectively isolate the sick or maintain hygiene standards turned cold seasons into deadly periods for many communities. The winter environment, combined with social and infrastructural shortcomings, created perfect conditions for sickness to flourish. Child mortality in winter. Children were especially vulnerable to the harsh conditions of medieval winters. Malnutrition, combined with susceptibility to infections like pneumonia, measles, and diarrheal diseases, led to high child mortality rates during the cold months. The lack of effective medical care and poor living conditions meant many children did not survive beyond infancy or early childhood. Cold exposure and inadequate clothing further weakened their defenses. Records from the period often highlight spikes in child deaths in winter, which had a profound demographic impact on families and communities. The emotional toll on parents was enormous, and the loss of children was a tragic and common aspect of medieval life, exacerbated by the brutal winters. Winter and mental illness. The psychological effects of long, dark, and harsh winters also took a toll on medieval populations. While mental illness was poorly understood, historical accounts suggest that conditions like depression and anxiety worsened during winter months. The lack of sunlight, isolation, and constant struggle for survival contributed to what we might now recognize as seasonal affective disorder, SAD, and other mood disorders. Social withdrawal, irritability, and despair were common responses to the bleakness of winter. Treatment for mental illness was rudimentary and often cruel, with few resources available to sufferers. Despite this, communities relied on social bonds, religion, and ritual to support those affected. The mental strain of winter compounded the physical hardships, making the cold months a deeply challenging time for both body and mind. The struggles of travel and trade. Roads turned to mud and ice. Medieval travel was always challenging, but winter made roads almost impassable. Unlike modern paved highways, medieval roads were mostly dirt tracks that turned to thick, sticky mud with thawing snow or rain. When temperatures dropped below freezing, this mud would harden into slick ice, creating treacherous conditions for travelers. Carriages, carts, and horseback riders struggled to maintain footing, leading to frequent accidents and delays. Horses and pack animals often slipped, injuring themselves or losing valuable loads. The roads between towns and villages became hazardous, slowing commerce and isolating communities. For merchants and peasants alike, a simple journey that might take a day in summer stretched into several in winter. This disruption was critical because it meant essential goods, including food, fuel, and raw materials, arrived late or not at all. Road maintenance was minimal, with local peasants expected to clear paths, but cold weather often froze the ground solid, making repairs difficult. This seasonal obstacle was one of the biggest barriers to communication and economic activity in the medieval period. Merchant routes closed. The difficulties on roads meant many merchant routes closed entirely during the winter months. Trading caravans that moved goods such as spices, cloth, metals, and foodstuffs faced enormous risk if they tried to continue. The cost of lost or damaged goods, combined with the danger to life, forced many traders to halt their journeys until spring. This stoppage had wide-reaching consequences. Towns dependent on trade suffered shortages and price hikes. Luxury goods became unavailable, and even basic commodities like salt or grain could become scarce in certain regions. The closure of routes also disrupted the flow of news and information, leaving regions more isolated. Coastal traders sometimes shifted their efforts to sea routes, but winter storms made maritime trade just as perilous. In some cases, merchants used winter downtime to repair equipment, plan future routes, or engage in local trade, but the large-scale movement of goods slowed drastically. These seasonal halts underscored how much medieval economies relied on weather and natural conditions beyond human control. Isolation in winter villages. Villages in medieval Europe could become almost completely cut off during winter. With roads impassable and trade routes closed, many rural communities faced weeks or even months without outside contact. This isolation had profound effects. Supplies like grain, salt, and firewood became precious commodities, rationed carefully to last the long winter. News from other regions slowed to a trickle, increasing fear and superstition among villagers. Social life was limited to the village itself, with festivals and gatherings becoming rare. Isolation also worsened hardships during bad winters, as help was difficult or impossible to call for in case of famine, disease outbreaks, or accidents. The mental toll of confinement was significant, leading to increased stress and a feeling of vulnerability. For the nobility and monasteries with large estates, isolation was less severe, but even they struggled with the lack of fresh food and goods. Overall, the winter months emphasized how fragile medieval communities were when cut off from the broader world. Animal transport was dangerous. Transporting goods and people relied heavily on animals like horses, oxen, and mules. Winter conditions greatly increased the dangers for these animals and their handlers. Thick snow and ice made footing uncertain, and animals were prone to slipping and falling. The cold sapped their strength, especially when forage was scarce. Frostbite and illness were common, reducing the number of usable beasts. Caravans had to move slowly and carefully, often stopping frequently to rest animals, prolonging journeys. Animal-driven sledges replaced carts in some snowbound areas, but these had limited capacity. The loss of animals was a serious economic blow to peasants and traders, who depended on them for their livelihoods. Additionally, the risk to humans was high, with travelers exposed to the elements, often poorly clothed against winter's biting cold. Some merchants hired guides or formed groups for protection and mutual support, but many avoided travel altogether during harsh winters, further limiting the flow of goods. Frozen rivers and ports. Rivers and ports were vital arteries for trade and communication in the medieval period. Many towns and cities sprang up along waterways, which allowed easier transport of bulky goods. However, winter posed a huge obstacle when rivers froze or ports iced over. A frozen river was essentially a dead trade route, cutting off supplies to cities that depended on river traffic. Ports faced similar problems, with docks and ships immobilized by ice. This seasonal freeze was unpredictable, varying year to year, but could last weeks or months in colder climates. Ship captains and merchants feared setting sail in winter storms, which were more frequent and violent. Frozen waterways forced traders to rely more heavily on the already difficult land routes, worsening delays and shortages. For fishing communities, frozen ports meant loss of income and food supply, as they could not send their catch to market. The loss of river and sea transport in winter was a critical factor in medieval economies and contributed to widespread hardship. Risky mountain crossings. Mountain passes were key routes linking regions separated by difficult terrain. In medieval Europe, important trade and pilgrimage routes passed through mountain ranges such as the Alps and Pyrenees. However, winter transformed these passages into deadly gauntlets. Heavy snow, avalanches, and freezing temperatures made mountain travel perilous. Roads were often blocked or buried under snowdrifts, with no rescue or maintenance services to assist stranded travelers. Many who attempted crossings faced frostbite, hypothermia, or worse. The lack of accurate maps and poor communication meant travelers could easily become lost. Despite the dangers, trade and pilgrimage routes had to be maintained, and brave or desperate merchants and pilgrims often risked the journey. Local guides sometimes led groups through safer paths, but the risks remained high. The threat of robbery or attack compounded difficulties. These hazardous mountain crossings underscored the immense challenges medieval people endured to maintain contact and commerce during winter. Pilgrimages in winter. Pilgrimages were a major aspect of medieval religious life, drawing thousands to holy sites across Europe and beyond. While most pilgrimages happened during warmer months, some brave pilgrims attempted the journey in winter. This choice often came from deep religious devotion or urgent personal vows. However, winter pilgrimages were grueling undertakings. Harsh weather, difficult terrain, and limited shelter exposed pilgrims to cold, hunger, and disease. Roads were dangerous, and inns were few and far between. Pilgrims carried few supplies, often traveling on foot or by mule, increasing vulnerability. The risk of illness was high, and many did not survive the journey. Despite these hardships, winter pilgrimages continued because faith was a powerful motivator, offering hope and spiritual solace during bleak times. Religious institutions sometimes offered assistance or refuge, but overall, winter pilgrimage was a testament to medieval endurance and belief. No maps, just memory. In an age before detailed maps, medieval travelers relied heavily on memory, local knowledge, and oral directions. Winter made navigation even harder, as landmarks could be obscured by snow and daylight hours were short. Travelers often depended on familiar routes learned from parents or local guides. However, the winter landscape could transform a well-known path into a confusing maze. Lost travelers faced extreme danger, as exposure to cold could quickly become fatal. The lack of reliable maps and signposts increased the risk of becoming stranded in wilderness areas. Towns and villages might be missed, cutting off access to food and shelter. This reliance on memory and local knowledge was a vulnerability that compounded winter travel's perils. Travelers who did not know the routes well were especially at risk, and many perished from disorientation or exposure. Caravans stopped moving. The cumulative difficulties of winter, muddy or icy roads, freezing temperatures, animal illness, and lack of food supplies, often forced caravans to halt completely. Long-distance trade depended on regular movement of goods, but winter imposed a natural pause on this rhythm. Merchants had to store their goods safely, often in poorly heated warehouses or storerooms, risking spoilage or theft. The loss of income from stalled trade was devastating for many families and towns. In some regions, entire commercial seasons were lost to winter. Caravans that did set out risked attacks by bandits, who took advantage of isolated, slow-moving groups. The suspension of caravan travel also meant that regional markets became less connected, prices fluctuated wildly, and shortages were common. This forced waiting was a hard reality that shaped medieval economic life, demonstrating how dependent medieval societies were on seasonal cycles. Winter meant waiting. Ultimately, winter in the medieval period was a time of enforced patience. Whether it was waiting for roads to thaw, rivers to open, animals to recover, or markets to resume, people had to adapt to the rhythm of the seasons. This waiting was not passive but involved preparing for the coming months, repairing equipment, preserving food, and tending to animals indoors. It also meant enduring hardship with limited resources and increased risk of sickness and isolation. For traders and travelers, winter delays were frustrating but unavoidable. They understood that the natural world dictated the pace of life, and survival often depended on resilience and hope. This enforced pause also shaped social and economic structures, with communal efforts focused on support and survival until spring returned. The long wait of winter was a defining feature of medieval existence, testing patience, faith, and endurance. The poor and the cold. Peasants' struggles in harsh weather. Medieval peasants faced some of the harshest conditions during winter, as their survival depended heavily on the land and what little resources they had. Without proper insulation or modern heating, the cold penetrated even the thickest of woolen clothes, and short daylight hours meant they had less time to complete their necessary tasks. Farming activities slowed dramatically, but the demand for food and firewood remained urgent. Peasants had to endure frostbite while tending to animals or fetching water, often risking their lives to ensure their families did not starve or freeze. Heavy snowfalls could block paths, making trips to market or church dangerous or impossible. Insufficient, offering little insulation. Starvation was common, and many died unnoticed in alleys or fields, their bodies covered only by a thin layer of snow. Some relied on the charity of monks, nuns, or wealthy patrons, but such help was sporadic and limited. Winter turned the streets into a graveyard for those without homes or families, highlighting the brutal social inequalities of medieval society. Child labor in winter. While winter slowed agricultural work, children among the poor were still expected to contribute to household survival. This often meant collecting firewood, tending to animals, or assisting in small crafts and chores that were possible despite the weather. Their small bodies were vulnerable to the cold, and long hours outdoors could lead to frostbite or exhaustion. Many children lacked adequate clothing or shoes, exposing them to dangerous cold that could stunt growth or cause lasting health issues. In some cases, children worked in dangerous trades such as mill tending or chimney sweeping, exposed to icy winds and freezing temperatures. Winter child labor was a harsh reality, reflecting the overall deprivation of the lower classes and the necessity of every family member's contribution for survival. Frozen fingers and toes. Frostbite was a constant danger for the poor during winter. Without proper clothing or shelter, exposure to cold winds and freezing temperatures caused fingers and toes to freeze, sometimes leading to gangrene and the loss of limbs. Peasants working outside or walking long distances often suffered numbness, pain, and swelling. Healing was slow and difficult without medical knowledge or proper care. Frozen extremities impaired the ability to work or even perform daily tasks, further endangering survival. The pain and disability caused by frostbite were part of the everyday suffering of winter, and many carried the physical scars for life. Fires that rarely stayed lit. Firewood was a precious commodity, and the poor struggled to keep fires burning throughout the long winter nights. Gathering would require time and energy, and the supply was often limited by local laws or the availability of forests. Fires were kept small to conserve fuel, providing only minimal warmth. This meant that cold air quickly returned to fill homes once the fire died down. Ash and soot filled poorly ventilated spaces, choking inhabitants and worsening respiratory problems. Many had to choose between warmth and cooking, as both competed for the limited firewood supply. Fire was also a social focus. Gathered around a hearth, families shared stories and comfort. But for many poor peasants, the fire was cold and short-lived, offering little solace against the brutal winter chill. Winter taxes and burdens. Despite their suffering, peasants were still required to pay taxes and fulfill feudal duties even during the harshest winters. Lords demanded grain, labor, and money, leaving little for peasants to store for their own survival. Failure to meet these obligations could result in harsh punishment or eviction from the land. Additionally, Winter brought extra burdens such as fees for wood collection or transport, tolls on frozen roads, and charges for market access. These economic pressures increased poverty and desperation during a time when resources were already stretched to the limit. The weight of winter taxes and burdens contributed to social tensions and sometimes to rebellion or flight from estates, as peasants struggled to keep their families alive under oppressive conditions. Dying in silence. Winter was a deadly season for the poor, with many dying quietly and unnoticed in their homes or the streets. The cold weakened bodies and immune systems, making illness and starvation common causes of death. Limited medical care meant many suffered without relief, and funerals were modest or non-existent. Families often lacked resources for proper burial, and some were buried in mass graves or near churches. The harsh winter conditions made travel to cemeteries difficult, and snow could delay or prevent funeral rites. Death in winter. Few celebrations often encouraged overindulgence in food and drink. Clergy preached that the bitter cold was a reminder of humanity's fall from grace and the need for penance. The hardships of winter symbolized the spiritual barrenness that could overtake the soul if it strayed from God's path. Sin and suffering were intertwined concepts, and surviving winter required not only physical endurance but also spiritual vigilance. The faithful were urged to use this difficult season for reflection, repentance, and preparation for the promise of renewal in spring. The devil in the storm. Storms in winter, howling winds, blinding snow, and relentless cold were often attributed to the work of the devil or evil spirits in medieval thought. The chaotic, destructive power of winter weather was seen as a manifestation of Satan's wrath, punishing sinners and testing the faithful. Thunderstorms in winter, though rare, were especially feared as signs of demonic activity. Folklore told of witches and devils riding the storms, bringing curses and misfortune to those who dared venture out. People sought protection through prayers, charms, and religious relics, believing these could shield them from the devil's influence. The storm was a potent symbol of the spiritual battle between good and evil, and the violent forces of nature reinforced the sense that humanity was caught in a cosmic struggle. The winter storm was not just a natural phenomenon but a fearful, supernatural event that shaped medieval fears and rituals. Monks and winter fasting. Monastic life in the Middle Ages was deeply affected by the rhythms of the seasons, and winter fasting was a strict part of religious discipline. Monks adhered to rigorous fasting schedules, often abstaining from meat, dairy, and rich foods during the cold months, seeing this as a form of spiritual purification. The scarcity of fresh food in winter made fasting both a spiritual and practical necessity. Monastic rules emphasized penance, prayer, and contemplation, with monks using winter's hardships as a time to deepen their devotion. The cold and hunger were reminders of Christ's suffering and a way to emulate his sacrifice. Monks often consumed simple, boiled grains and vegetables stored from the harvest, and relied heavily on preserved foods like salted fish. Winter fasting was also seen as a communal experience, uniting the monks in shared sacrifice and reinforcing their spiritual commitment. This austere lifestyle contrasted with the struggles of the lay population, but both were bound by the season's harsh realities. Visions and dreams in cold nights. Long winter nights were fertile ground for visions and dreams, phenomena deeply respected and feared in medieval culture. The cold, isolation, and quiet of winter made the mind more susceptible to vivid dreams and spiritual experiences. People believed that the soul was more active during the darkest months and that divine or demonic messages could be received through dreams. Monks and mystics recorded many such visions, interpreting them as guidance or warnings. Villagers often shared stories of prophetic dreams that foretold illness, death, or miraculous events. The cold air and silence of winter nights seemed to open a veil between the natural and supernatural worlds. These experiences reinforced the medieval belief that life was governed by unseen forces and that the spiritual realm was particularly accessible in times of hardship. Winter dreams were both a source of hope and dread, reflecting the intense psychological and spiritual struggles of the season. Winter and the end times. Medieval people frequently associated winter with apocalyptic imagery and the end of the world. The death-like quality of winter, the barren fields, leafless trees, and frozen rivers, was seen as a metaphor for the final judgment and the decay of the earth before resurrection. The Bible's references to darkness, cold, and suffering were linked to the idea that winter symbolized humanity's spiritual decline before the coming of Christ's return. During particularly harsh winters or times of plague and famine, fears of the end times intensified. Sermons and popular tales warned that the world was growing cold not only in climate but in faith and morality. Winter's hardships were interpreted as divine punishment, a sign that the last days were near. This apocalyptic mindset shaped how medieval people understood their suffering, giving it cosmic meaning and urging repentance and preparation for salvation. Stories by the hearth. Despite the fears and hardships, winter nights around the hearth were a time of storytelling and communal bonding. The hearth was the warm center of medieval homes, where families and neighbors gathered to share tales passed down through generations. These stories mixed folklore, legends, moral lessons, and humor, providing entertainment and comfort during long, cold evenings. Tales of brave knights, cunning animals, witches, and saints kept imaginations alive and reinforced cultural values. Storytelling was also a way to teach children about their history and beliefs, preserving oral traditions in a largely illiterate society. The flickering firelight and shared warmth created an intimate setting where people could momentarily escape the harshness outside. These hearth stories were essential to medieval social life, fostering connection and resilience during the bleak winter months. How cold shaped religion. The cold and darkness of winter deeply influenced medieval religious practices and symbolism. Seasonal festivals such as Christmas and Candlemas, medieval society explain and endure the cruel realities of winter, seeing them as part of a divine plan. Cold nights and eternal thoughts. The solitude and stillness of cold winter nights prompted deep reflection on life, death, and eternity. Away from the distractions of work and travel, medieval people often turned inward, contemplating their souls and the afterlife. The starkness of winter symbolized the brevity and fragility of human existence. Monks wrote extensively about the dark night of the soul, a metaphor for spiritual struggle and purification experienced in isolation and suffering. For many, the long nights were a time to meditate on mortality and prepare for death with prayer and repentance. This heightened awareness of eternity gave winter a solemn, sacred quality. The cold nights were not just physical but spiritual experiences, shaping medieval attitudes toward life's ultimate questions and the hope of salvation beyond the frost. Christmas in harsh winters. Christmas in the medieval period was far different from the warm, cozy holiday celebrations many know today. The festival of Christmas was celebrated amidst the brutal backdrop of harsh winters, where the cold was relentless and survival was often uncertain. The harshness of the season gave the celebration a profound significance, as it symbolized not only the birth of Christ but also the triumph of light and hope over darkness and despair. In medieval Europe, winters were unforgiving. Snow blanketed the land, and temperatures plunged far below freezing. Villagers huddled together for warmth, often struggling to find enough food to sustain themselves. In such times, Christmas became a beacon of joy and a brief respite from the bleakness. The church calendar played a crucial role in marking the days leading up to Christmas, with Advent serving as a period of anticipation and spiritual preparation. Advent itself was often a time of fasting and reflection, designed to ready the faithful for the joyous celebration. Despite the hardships, Christmas was celebrated with great enthusiasm. It was a time when the social order could be momentarily relaxed, and communities came together to share food, music, and fellowship. The Christmas feast was a highlight, even if it was modest compared to modern standards. For many peasants, this meant a rare indulgence, sometimes including preserved meats, fresh bread if available, and ale or wine. Nobles enjoyed more lavish feasts, but all recognized the importance of sharing and generosity during the season. Religious observances were central to Christmas. The midnight mass was a solemn and beautiful ritual that brought people together in the cold, dark churches. Candles illuminated the stone interiors, and hymns filled the air, creating a powerful contrast to the winter gloom outside. The story of Christ's birth was reenacted in plays and pageants, reminding all present of the divine light entering a dark world. In many regions, local customs and folklore enriched Christmas celebrations. The tradition of wassailing, which involved singing and toasting to the health of trees and crops, had roots in pagan rituals celebrating fertility and renewal but was integrated into Christian festivities. Similarly, the decoration of homes with evergreen boughs symbolized eternal life and resilience in the face of winter's deathly grip. However, not all was joyous during medieval Christmas. The harsh conditions meant that many struggled even during this holy season. Cold and illness were common, and the hope that Christmas brought was tempered by the reality of hardship. The juxtaposition of celebration with survival created a unique atmosphere, one where faith and festivity intertwined deeply with the human experience of endurance. The harshness of the winter also influenced the timing and manner of Christmas celebrations. Travel was difficult, so festivities were largely local. Markets and fairs that usually brought distant traders and entertainers were curtailed, making the holiday more community-centered. Homes were filled with the scent of burning wood and spiced foods, as families sought to create warmth and comfort in the face of nature's severity. In sum, Christmas in harsh medieval winters was more than a festival. It was a profound cultural and spiritual event that offered light and hope during the darkest and coldest time of the year. It encapsulated the medieval struggle with the elements and the enduring human spirit's capacity to find meaning and joy despite adversity. Yule logs and symbolism. The Yule log was a central symbol of medieval winter festivities, representing warmth, life, and continuity amidst the cold and darkness of winter. The tradition of burning a large log during the Yule season has ancient origins, rooted in pagan solstice celebrations. Decorate homes and churches, reminding people of the cyclical nature of seasons and the promise of spring. The use of such greenery also helped to brighten the dark winter homes, filling them with color and fragrance. The Yule log tradition also served practical purposes. Its slow-burning fire provided a lasting source of heat and light in homes that lacked modern heating. In an era when daylight was scarce and long winter nights could be frightening, the glowing hearth was a vital comfort. Over time, the Yule log evolved into various customs. In some regions, children would jump over the fire or carry pieces of the burned log to protect their homes. In others, cakes and sweets shaped like logs were made, a practice that eventually gave rise to the modern Yule log cake. The endurance of the Yule log tradition into the medieval period highlights how communities adapted ancient practices to their current beliefs and needs. It was a way to assert control over the dark and cold, to find warmth and meaning, and to connect with both the spiritual and natural worlds during the harshest season of the year. Solstice celebrations. The winter solstice, marking the shortest day and longest night of the year, was a significant turning point for medieval communities. Although the Christian calendar focused on Christmas as the celebration of light, many solstice traditions continued to influence medieval winter festivities. These celebrations honored the return of the sun and the gradual lengthening of days, symbolizing hope and renewal. Solstice celebrations were deeply tied to agricultural cycles. For medieval peasants, whose survival depended on the land, the solstice was a reminder that spring and planting would come again. This seasonal rhythm was critical for understanding the passage of time and the natural world's power over human life. In many parts of Europe, solstice festivals included feasting, dancing, and rituals designed to encourage the sun's return and ensure the fertility of the land. Some customs involved lighting fires or candles to symbolize the sun's light overcoming darkness. These practices had pagan roots but were often incorporated into Christian celebrations, creating a rich tapestry of meaning. The solstice also had an important social dimension. It was a time when communities came together to celebrate, reinforcing social bonds that were essential for survival through the difficult winter months. Feasts and gatherings allowed people to share scarce resources and offer mutual support. Medieval churches sometimes held special services near the solstice, emphasizing the birth of Christ as the light of the world. This Christian framing helped assimilate older customs into the new religious context, ensuring continuity and meaning for the people. Folklore surrounding the solstice often featured stories of light triumphing over darkness, a powerful metaphor for human resilience. These narratives offered comfort and inspiration during a season marked by cold, scarcity, and isolation. The solstice celebrations also reflected the medieval worldview, where natural phenomena were intertwined with spiritual significance. Observing the sun's cycle was both a practical and mystical act, connecting people to the cosmos and their place within it. Through these festivities, the harshness of winter was transformed from a mere challenge into a profound experience of renewal and hope. The solstice stood as a symbol of the enduring human spirit and the promise of brighter days ahead. Candles and ritual light. In medieval winters, when daylight hours were few and often clouded by snow and fog, light was more than just a practical necessity, it was a sacred symbol. Candles and other sources of light played a crucial role in rituals and daily life during the dark months. Candles were expensive and precious. Made from tallow or beeswax, they were used sparingly and often reserved for religious ceremonies or important household rituals. In churches, candles illuminated altars, statues, and sacred texts, symbolizing divine presence and guidance in the darkness. The use of candles in medieval winter festivals was deeply symbolic. They represented hope, faith, and the light of Christ entering a world shadowed by sin and despair. Lighting candles was an act of spiritual defense against evil, a way to invite protection and blessings into homes and communities. Families often kept vigil by candlelight during winter nights, praying or telling stories that reinforced shared values and beliefs. Candles were lit on specific feast days, such as Candlemas, which marked the presentation of Jesus at the temple. Overall, the use of candles and ritual light during medieval winters was a powerful expression of human hope and spirituality. In a world dominated by cold and darkness, these small flames carried immense meaning, illuminating not just physical spaces but also the hearts and minds of the faithful. Winter songs and chants. Music was a vital part of medieval winter festivities, helping to lift spirits and bind communities together during the bleakest months. Winter songs and chants echoed through homes, churches, and village squares, offering warmth and comfort amid the cold. Many of these songs had religious themes, celebrating the birth of Christ, the promise of salvation, and the triumph of light over darkness. Carols, as they were called, were often sung in Latin by choirs in churches, but vernacular songs in local languages were common among the general populace. Caroling was more than entertainment. It was a form of communal worship and a means of passing on stories and beliefs. Groups of singers might go from house to house, spreading cheer and receiving gifts of food or money in return. This tradition helped reinforce social bonds and mutual support during winter. Some winter songs had pagan origins, celebrating the solstice, nature's cycles, or ancient deities. These were sometimes adapted or reinterpreted to fit Christian teachings, creating a layered and complex musical tradition. The melodies of medieval winter songs were often simple and repetitive, making them easy to learn and remember. This simplicity allowed them to be shared widely, crossing social classes and regions. In monasteries and cathedrals, elaborate chants accompanied liturgical ceremonies. Gregorian chant, with its haunting and meditative tones, created an atmosphere of solemnity and reflection, contrasting with the more lively secular songs. Music also played a role in secular winter festivities, such as fairs, feasts, and dances. Instruments like the lute, harp, and flute accompanied singers, adding richness to the celebrations. Through these songs and chants, the medieval people expressed their joys, fears, and hopes. Music was a means of coping with the harshness of winter, a source of joy, and a powerful symbol of the enduring human spirit. Sure, here is the full expanded detailed script continuing from 8.6 feast days that brought joy, flowing seamlessly through all subheadings in heading 8, with about 1,000 words for each section. Feast days that brought joy. Despite the biting cold and the hardships of medieval winters, feast days were the bright spots that punctuated the dark months. These special days, rooted deeply in the religious calendar, offered a chance for communities, both noble and common, to gather, celebrate, and find joy amid scarcity. The cold outside was temporarily forgotten as the warmth of fellowship, food, and ritual filled homes and halls. The most important of these feast days was, of course, Christmas. It was the pinnacle of winter festivities, celebrating the birth of Christ with solemn masses, elaborate feasts, and a suspension of everyday toil. For many peasants, the Christmas feast represented a rare opportunity for indulgence. After months of meager diets relying heavily on grains and root vegetables, the holiday might bring salted or dried meat, fresh bread, cheeses, and even sweet treats like honey cakes if supplies allowed. For the nobility, Feasts were extravagant affairs with multiple courses featuring wild game, spiced wines, and imported delicacies, all served in grand halls decorated with evergreens and candlelight. Following Christmas, other feast days continued the festive spirit through the winter. St. Stephen's Day, December 26th, also known as Boxing Day, was another occasion for communal generosity. Traditionally, it was a time when gifts, often in the form of food or coins, were given to the poor and to servants, symbolizing charity and kindness. In some regions, it was customary for groups of youths or wassailers to go door to door singing and offering blessings in exchange for food and drink. Epiphany, January 6th, which commemorated the visit of the Magi to the Christ child, was celebrated with particular fanfare in many parts of Europe. The day was marked by special masses, processions, and in some places, the ceremonial king cake, a sweetbread containing a hidden bean or figurine. Whoever found the token was crowned king or queen for the day, often tasked with leading festivities and games. Candlemas, February 2nd, was another significant feast marking the presentation of Jesus at the temple. It symbolized purification and the return of light, fittingly celebrated with the blessing and lighting of candles. This feast helped to spiritually bridge the gap between the deep winter darkness and the forthcoming arrival of spring. Feast days brought a vital sense of rhythm and structure to the long winter months. They were occasions for people to pause from the daily grind of survival, to eat heartily, share stories, and renew bonds of community. These celebrations reinforced social hierarchies but also provided moments of social leveling. During feasts, even peasants might enjoy a greater measure of freedom and joy than usual. The preparation for these days was often a communal effort. Food had to be preserved carefully, meat salted or smoked, grains stored in dry conditions, and root vegetables kept underground. The entire community might participate in hunting, gathering, baking, and brewing to ensure an ample supply for the festivities. Beyond mere indulgence, feast days had profound spiritual significance. They were moments of religious reflection, communal prayer, and reaffirmation of faith. The hardships of winter made the hope and promise embodied in these celebrations all the more meaningful. In essence, medieval winter feast days were lifelines, points of light, warmth, and hope that sustained people through the coldest, darkest time of the year. They were deeply woven into the fabric of medieval life, expressing human resilience and the enduring power of tradition. The role of the Church. The Church held a central and commanding role in medieval winter festivities, shaping both the spiritual and social dimensions of the season. It was the Church's calendar that structured the winter months, marking key feast days and holy observances that provided rhythm and meaning to the harsh season. In a time when the natural world was unpredictable and often hostile, the Church offered explanations, rituals, and communal gatherings that helped people cope with the challenges of winter. It was the Church's voice that proclaimed Christmas as the birth of the Savior, the ultimate light coming into a darkened world, and it was in churches that many of the season's rituals took place. Church services during winter were rich and elaborate. Midnight Mass on Christmas Eve was a highlight, often drawing large congregations despite the cold and difficult travel. Churches were decorated with greenery and candles, their interiors lit with flickering flames that contrasted with the dark winter nights outside. Choirs sang hymns and chants that echoed solemnly, creating an atmosphere of awe and reverence. The Church also sanctioned and incorporated older, pagan customs into its observances, creating a syncretic culture. Practices like the burning of the Yule log or the celebration of the solstice were reinterpreted in Christian terms. This blend made the new faith more accessible to the common folk while preserving a link to the rhythms of nature. Clergy often took active roles beyond spiritual leadership. They might organize communal feasts, distribute alms to the poor, and lead processions through towns and villages. In monasteries, the winter months were times of intense prayer, fasting, and contemplation, but also of hospitality, where travelers and the needy could find refuge. The Church's emphasis on charity during the winter was crucial. Fasting during Advent and Lent balanced the festive indulgence of Christmas and Easter, reminding people of the need for humility and spiritual discipline. At the same time, almsgiving during feast days helped alleviate some of the suffering caused by winter scarcity. In villages and towns, the Church was often the hub of social life during winter, a place where people gathered not only for worship but for education, counsel, and communal support. The church calendar provided a shared framework that united diverse populations in common observance. Moreover, the church's theological framing of winter and its trials helped people find meaning in suffering. The cold and darkness were seen as part of a divine plan, with Christ's birth symbolizing hope, redemption, and renewal. This spiritual lens gave people strength to endure the hardships of winter. In short, the church's role in medieval winter festivities was multifaceted and vital. It provided structure, ritual, charity, and spiritual guidance, helping people navigate the long, cold months with faith and communal support. Masks and merrymaking. Winter festivities in the medieval period were not only solemn religious events but also occasions for exuberant merrymaking. Masks and costumes were central to many celebrations, adding an element of mystery, inversion, and playful chaos to the dark season. The use of masks during winter festivals had roots in ancient traditions. They allowed participants to take on different identities, often crossing social boundaries and subverting normal roles. This temporary release from everyday constraints was a vital psychological relief during the oppressive winter months. One well-known tradition was the Feast of Fools, celebrated mainly in the 12th and 13th centuries. During this feast, lower clergy or even laypeople would parody church rituals, donning masks and costumes, and engaging in humorous or irreverent behavior. This allowed communities to laugh at authority and the rigid social order, a safety valve that helped maintain stability throughout the year. Masks were also used in plays and pageants performed during Christmas and New Year celebrations. These theatrical performances combined religious themes with popular folklore, bringing stories of saints, devils, and mythical creatures to life. Costumes and masks enhanced the dramatic effect, captivating audiences and adding a festive flair. In rural communities, masks might represent spirits of the dead, animals, or elemental force. Dancing in the cold. Dancing was an integral part of medieval winter celebrations, serving both social and symbolic functions. Despite, or perhaps because of, the bitter cold, people gathered to dance in halls, around hearths, and even outdoors during festivals. Dance was a way to generate warmth and energy, literally and figuratively. The physical movement helped combat the chill, while the communal activity fostered joy and solidarity. In a time without modern heating, dancing was one of the few ways to stay warm and alive in body and spirit. Winter dances varied widely depending on region and social class. Among peasants, circle dances, line dances, and simple group steps were common, often accompanied by singing or instrumental music played on fiddles, flutes, or drums. These dances were accessible and participatory, involving the entire community. In noble courts, dances became more formalized and choreographed, with complex steps and etiquette. Courtly dances were opportunities for socializing, forming alliances, and displaying grace and status. Winter festivities provided rare occasions when nobles and their retinues could indulge in leisure and entertainment. Dance was often associated with ritual meanings. Some dances were linked to fertility and renewal, invoking blessings on crops and livestock for the coming year. Others marked transitions in the calendar or celebrated particular saints' days. Despite the cold, outdoor dances were common during major festivals. Bonfires or torches provided light and some warmth as villagers gathered to dance under the stars. These open-air celebrations reinforced community bonds and the shared experience of enduring winter. The church's stance on dancing was ambivalent. While it condemned certain dances as sinful or disorder, it also permitted and promoted dances linked to religious festivals. Clergy sometimes participated or organized dances to encourage wholesome socializing. In essence, dancing in the cold was a vital form of expression and connection during medieval winters. It combined physical vitality, social interaction, and spiritual symbolism, helping people to embrace life even in the darkest months. Looking forward to spring. As winter wore on, the promise of spring became a beacon of hope for medieval people. The long, cold months tested their endurance, but also heightened their anticipation for the renewal and abundance that the warmer season would bring. This hope was reflected in both practical preparations and spiritual attitudes. Farmers dreamed of planting seeds and seeing the first green shoots break through the earth. Families looked forward to fresher foods, longer days, and the return of outdoor work and travel. Winter festivals often ended with rituals that symbolized the farewell to winter and the welcoming of spring. Candlemas, with its emphasis on light and purification, served as a spiritual turning point. In some regions, effigies of winter or old year's figures were burned or discarded to mark the transition. The church's liturgical calendar also looked forward to spring with Lent and Easter, times of fasting followed by joyous celebration of resurrection and life. These observances provided a spiritual framework that helped people interpret natural cycles as part of divine order. Communities might also engage in early planting, clearing fields, and repairing tools in preparation for the busy agricultural season ahead. The collective effort to ready the land and homes was a hopeful, forward-looking activity that reinforced social cohesion. In stories and songs, spring was often personified as a young, vibrant force that chased away the darkness. This imagery helped people cope with winter's hardships by focusing on renewal and growth. Ultimately, the transition from winter to spring was a moment of profound significance in medieval life. It represented survival, resilience, and the unending cycle of nature and faith. The lessons learned during winter, patience, cooperation, and hope, carried forward into the planting and growing seasons. Sleeping together for warmth. In the harsh medieval winters, when temperatures plunged and biting winds howled through uninsulated homes, one of the most vital survival strategies was the simple act of sleeping close together. People understood that shared body heat was a precious resource, and communal sleeping arrangements were common, especially among family members and sometimes entire households. Medieval homes, particularly those of peasants, were small and often consisted of a single room. This limited space naturally fostered shared sleeping. Beds were typically large wooden frames covered with straw or rushes, topped with coarse wool or linen sheets, and covered with blankets or animal pelts. These shared beds not only conserved warmth but also provided psychological comfort, reinforcing bonds in a season of hardship and isolation. Sleeping close to others reduced heat loss significantly. In an era without modern insulation or heating, human warmth was a crucial defense against hypothermia and illness. This practical arrangement was often accompanied by shared clothing, like nightcaps and heavy cloaks, which were worn even while sleeping to preserve heat. In castles and manor houses, servants and retainers often slept together in common dormitories. The close quarters meant warmth was maximized, even if privacy was minimal. Nobles, too, might share beds with attendants or family to conserve heat during particularly brutal winters. The benefits extended beyond physical warmth. In the dark and silence of long winter nights, the presence of others provided emotional security against fears of the supernatural or illness. The medieval mind, steeped in superstition, often feared spirits and demons that were said to roam at night. The company of others was both a practical and spiritual shield. The custom of communal sleeping persisted across social classes and regions. While not everyone enjoyed the luxury of large beds or ample bedding, the principle of shared warmth was universal. This close proximity often meant that children, elderly, and the sick could be cared for easily during the night. In summary, sleeping together was a fundamental, life-saving adaptation to the cold medieval winter. It symbolized human interdependence and resilience in the face of environmental hardship. Animal companionship. Animals were more than just livestock or pets in medieval times. They were vital companions in the struggle to survive winter. Their roles extended beyond economic value. Many animals provided warmth, security, and emotional comfort during the cold months. In peasant households, animals such as dogs, cats, and even smaller creatures like rabbits were often allowed inside homes during winter. Dogs, in particular, were highly valued not only for their companionship but also for their warmth. They often slept near or even on their owners' beds, sharing body heat in the cold, drafty houses. Cats played a crucial role in controlling rodents that might otherwise consume precious stored food. Their presence indoors was therefore welcomed, and their soft fur and warmth added to the household's comfort. Larger animals, like cows, sheep, and horses, were essential to survival but were usually kept in separate shelters or barns. However, Farmers and herders took great care to provide them with adequate fodder and shelter to ensure they survived winter and remained productive. The health of livestock directly affected the household's food supply and income. The human-animal bond was deeply emotional as well. In a time of isolation and hardship, the presence of animals offered companionship and psychological solace. Tales and legends from the medieval period often depict faithful animals as protectors and friends, reflecting the importance of these bonds. In some monasteries, animals were treated with kindness and included in the winter care routines, symbolizing stewardship and compassion. The winter months saw special efforts to protect and care for animals, reflecting their integral place in medieval life. Overall, animal companionship was an essential factor in medieval winter survival, blending practical utility with emotional support. Layering with wool and fur. The medieval wardrobe, especially for winter, was built around the principle of layering, wearing multiple garments of wool, fur, and linen to trap heat and protect against cold winds. Wool was the most common fabric due to its insulating properties, availability, and durability. Peasants typically wore a woolen tunic or cloak over a linen undergarment. Multiple layers helped trap warm air between garments. When outdoors, fur-lined cloaks, hoods, and mittens were added for extra protection. Fur was more expensive and thus more common among wealthier classes, who might sport garments trimmed with squirrel, rabbit, or even mink fur. Headwear was crucial in retaining body heat, as much warmth is lost through the head. Woolen caps or hoods covered the head and neck, often combined with scarves made of linen or wool. Footwear was similarly layered, with leather boots lined with wool or stuffed with straw to keep feet dry and warm. Clothing was not only practical but often symbolic. Colors and quality of fabric indicated social status, while certain garments had ritual or cultural significance, such as cloaks worn during specific feast days or religious ceremonies. The layering principle extended indoors as well. People often wore their heaviest clothes inside during the coldest days, removing outer layers only when near the hearth. Wool's ability to remain warm even when damp made it indispensable during snowy or rainy weather. The process of making and maintaining these garments was labor-intensive. Wool had to be sheared, cleaned, carded, spun, and woven, usually by women at home. Fur was trapped or traded, then tanned and prepared carefully. Clothing was precious and often patched or recycled. In sum, the medieval approach to dressing for winter was both a science and an art, finely tuned to maximize warmth and comfort using the resources available. Stockpiling wood. Wood was the lifeblood of medieval winter survival. It fueled hearth fires that warmed homes, cooked food, and kept families alive through the coldest months. Consequently, stockpiling wood before winter was a critical and often communal effort. Harvesting and preparing wood was physically demanding. Men and boys gathered firewood from forests, hedgerows, and communal lands during late autumn. Wood had to be chopped, split, and stacked carefully to dry out and burn efficiently. Wet or green wood produced smoke and little heat, so seasoned wood was prized. Storage was also key. Wood piles were often kept near homes but covered or sheltered to keep them dry. In villages, communal wood stocks were sometimes maintained to ensure equitable distribution during harsh winters. Fires served multiple functions. They provided warmth in living spaces, but also were essential for cooking and baking. A fire's hearth was the heart of the home, where families gathered to eat, talk, and rest. In larger homes and castles, multiple hearths might be lit to warm different rooms. The presence of wood fires also had symbolic importance. Fire represented life, protection, and the light of Christ in a dark world. Winter festivals frequently involved ceremonial fires or the lighting of Yule logs to symbolize hope and renewal. Running out of wood could be catastrophic, leading to hypothermia, starvation, or forced migration. This made wood a highly valued resource, often carefully rationed during severe winters. In essence, stockpiling wood was a vital, ongoing task that underscored the medieval relationship with nature and community survival. Early routines and sleep cycles. Medieval people's daily routines and sleep patterns were shaped profoundly by the natural cycles of light and dark, especially in winter when daylight was scarce. The absence of artificial lighting meant that most activities were confined to daylight hours, with nights devoted largely to rest and sleep. In winter, people often rose late and went to bed early, adapting to the shorter days. Sleep was sometimes segmented, divided into a first sleep and second sleep with a waking period in between. During this waking time, individuals might pray, reflect, or perform quiet tasks by candlelight, communal gatherings, or quiet contemplation. Religious observances structured the day. Monks and nuns adhered to strict schedules of prayer throughout the day and night, balancing rest with devotion. Lay people's routines were more flexible but still shaped by church services and festivals. Despite the long nights, people valued rest and aimed for restorative sleep to endure winter hardships. The concept of sleep hygiene was rudimentary but understood. Warm beds, shared sleeping for warmth, and limiting physical exertion before bedtime. Preparation for the coming spring. This rhythm reflected a deep connection to natural cycles and a practical response to environmental constraints. Shared meals and warm ale. Food and drink were central to medieval winter survival, both for physical sustenance and social cohesion. Shared meals brought people together around the hearth, providing nourishment and warmth, as well as opportunities for storytelling and community bonding. Winter diets were necessarily limited by what could be stored or preserved from the harvest. Root vegetables, salted meats, dried grains, and legumes formed the staples. Fresh produce was rare, and meat was a luxury for most peasants. Meals were often cooked in large pots over open fires, producing hearty stews and pottages that could feed many at once. These dishes were nourishing and warming, ideal for cold days and nights. Ale was a ubiquitous drink during winter. It was often brewed at home and shared communally. Warm ale, sometimes spiced with herbs, was believed to aid digestion and provide comforting heat from within. It was safer to drink than often contaminated water sources. Communal feasts during festivals or after hard work were highlights of winter social life. They reinforced social bonds and offered relief from scarcity. These meals often involved sharing limited resources, reflecting the collective effort to survive. The act of eating together was more than practical. It was ritualistic and symbolic. It expressed solidarity and mutual support, vital in a time of hardship. Finding sunlight. Sunlight in winter was precious and scarce, especially in Northern Europe. People instinctively sought ways to maximize exposure to natural light, knowing it helped regulate mood, health, and daily rhythms. Medieval homes were designed to capture sunlight through south-facing windows or open hearths. People arranged daily activities to coincide with daylight hours, working or socializing near windows or in courtyards to absorb warmth and light. Sunlight was also linked to spiritual well-being. It was seen as a gift from God, symbolizing life, hope, and divine presence. In winter, the sun's return was eagerly anticipated and celebrated in festivals. The scarcity of light could cause feelings of gloom or melancholy, which we now recognize as seasonal affective disorder, SAD. Medieval remedies included herbal treatments, prayers, and social interaction to combat this seasonal depression. Children and adults alike treasured sunny moments, often taking walks or performing chores outdoors on bright days. The light was invigorating and a reminder of the cyclical nature of seasons. Thus, finding sunlight was both a practical and spiritual endeavor during winter. Making peace with cold. Living in a cold medieval world required more than physical adaptations. It required an attitude of acceptance and resilience. Making peace with cold meant acknowledging its inevitability and finding ways to coexist with it rather than fight it futilely. People developed cultural and religious narratives to help cope with winter's harshness. Cold was often framed as a test of faith or a form of purification. Endurance was seen as virtuous, a way to grow spiritually stronger. Prayers and rituals invoked protection from cold and illness, reinforcing community bonds and providing comfort. Stories and proverbs encouraged patience and fortitude. On a personal level, people adapted their behaviors, pacing themselves to conserve energy and maintain health. They valued rest and warmth but accepted occasional discomfort as part of life's natural order. This mental acceptance reduced anxiety and despair, fostering a stoic resilience essential for survival. Community support. Winter was a time when the strength of community networks was most vital. Neighbors helped each other gather firewood, share food, and care for the sick or elderly. Cooperation was often a matter of life and death. In villages and towns, communal resources like shared ovens, wells, and firewood stores helped ensure that everyone had access to essentials. Mutual aid societies, guilds, and church groups organized assistance for those in need. Festivals and religious gatherings reinforced social cohesion, providing emotional support and practical aid. Neighbors might band together to repair homes, tend animals, or clear snow. Hospitality was highly valued. Travelers or strangers were often taken in and sheltered. This spirit of generosity was rooted in both Christian charity and survival pragmatism. In sum, community support was a crucial buffer against winter's challenges, demonstrating medieval society's interdependence. Enduring for the spring. Ultimately, surviving winter meant enduring and preparing for the promise of spring. Medieval people understood their lives were cyclical, governed by nature's rhythms and divine will. The harsh months tested physical and mental strength, but they also reinforced hope. Spring represented renewal, growth, and the continuation of life. Preparations during winter, repairing tools, planning crops, and conserving resources were investments in the future. This forward-looking mindset helped people persevere. Spiritual beliefs framed endurance as part of a divine plan, encouraging patience and faith. In this way, the winter experience was both a trial and a preparation, shaping medieval people's relationship with nature, community, and faith. Chimneys and better hearths. The invention and gradual adoption of chimneys and improved hearth designs marked a transformative turning point in medieval life, especially during the long, cold winters that defined much of Europe's climate. Before chimneys became widespread, the open hearth, often located in the center of a room or in a large communal hall, was the primary source of heat and a place for cooking. However, these early hearths had significant limitations. Smoke and soot filled living spaces, causing discomfort, poor air quality, and even health issues. The evolution of chimneys and hearths was not simply a matter of engineering but an essential development that reshaped domestic life, social habits, and the architecture of homes. Early hearths, challenges and limitations. In medieval times, most homes featured open hearths without chimneys. These hearths were often large pits or stone fireplaces with no proper venting systems. The smoke produced by burning wood or peat would rise and linger inside, filling rooms and damaging lungs over time. People relied heavily on good ventilation, often through windows or roof openings, but this made it difficult to retain heat. The open hearth was usually located in a large hall used for cooking, eating, socializing, and sleeping. This central room could become smoky and dark, especially when the weather forced people to stay indoors for long stretches. Soot would settle on walls and ceilings, and the smoky environment posed constant discomfort, particularly for children, the elderly, and those with respiratory problems. The advent of chimneys. The introduction of chimneys is often traced to the 12th and 13th centuries in Europe, initially appearing in larger, wealthier homes and castles. Chimneys represented a radical improvement, creating a controlled channel to direct smoke outside the home while allowing the fire to burn hotter and more efficiently. Architectural evidence shows that chimneys began as simple stone or brick flues built into the walls of homes. Their design evolved gradually, often attached to the side of a building, and eventually integrated within the walls to conserve space and improve. Draft. The chimney's opening at the top, or the chimney pot, was designed to improve airflow and reduce backdrafts. This innovation drastically improved air quality inside homes, making indoor environments warmer and less smoky. Families could now gather more comfortably near the fire without suffering the oppressive smoke that once dominated living spaces. Impact on heating and cooking. The chimney allowed for the construction of larger and more efficient fireplaces. Hearths became more specialized and functional. Separate fireplaces for cooking and heating began to emerge. This separation allowed for better control of the heat source and improved the overall living conditions. With chimneys, homes became easier to heat evenly, encouraging the use of multiple fireplaces on different floors. This was especially important in multi-story houses and castles, where the upper floors were notoriously cold and difficult to heat. The ability to keep fires burning indoors without smoke accumulation also influenced cooking methods. Hearth cooking became more versatile. Pots could be hung over the fire, and food could be roasted or baked in nearby ovens connected to the hearth. This changed daily life significantly, expanding the variety of meals and improving food preservation by providing steady warmth. Social and cultural changes. The chimney's arrival influenced not only the physical space of homes but also social behavior. The warmth and comfort provided by better hearths encouraged more time spent indoors during winter months, promoting family bonding, storytelling, and crafts. It became possible to gather around the hearth for longer periods, creating the hearth as the symbolic heart of the home. Moreover, the chimney helped reduce the labor involved in maintaining a fire. Without smoke-filling rooms, women and children, the primary keepers of the hearth, could tend the fire more safely and efficiently, freeing time for other domestic activities such as weaving, sewing, or food preparation. The improved hearth also impacted clothing and sleeping habits. Warmer interiors reduced the need for heavy, cumbersome garments indoors and allowed for more comfortable sleeping arrangements with fewer layers of blankets. Technological evolution. Over the centuries, chimney and hearth designs continued to evolve. Innovations such as the smoke hood, chimney sweep, and flue dampers emerged to improve airflow and safety further. Chimneys also began to incorporate decorative elements, reflecting the owner's status and aesthetic preferences. In urban settings, where homes were closely packed, chimneys played a critical role in fire prevention by directing sparks and embers safely above rooftops. Regulations on chimney construction gradually appeared to reduce fire hazards. Regional variations. Different regions adapted chimney technology to local materials and climate. In Northern Europe, stone and brick were favored due to their fire resistance and heat retention. In parts of Southern Europe, simpler designs persisted longer due to warmer winters and architectural traditions. In castles and manor houses, chimneys became grand architectural features, often ornately decorated, symbolizing wealth and power. In more modest homes, chimneys were smaller but still a vital source of comfort. Limitations and challenges. While chimneys improved life greatly, they also brought new challenges. Poorly constructed chimneys could cause smoke to back up or fires to spread. Chimney maintenance became a necessary chore. Soot buildup required regular cleaning to prevent blockages and chimney fires. The profession of chimney sweeps arose, often involving children and apprentices working in dangerous conditions to clean narrow flues. This illustrates that every technological advance carries social and human costs. Conclusion. The arrival and refinement of chimneys and better hearths represent a critical chapter in the long road to comfort during medieval winters. This innovation enhanced not only physical warmth but also health, social life, and architecture. It marked a gradual shift from survival-driven existence toward a more comfortable and civilized lifestyle. Through chimneys, medieval people could create safer, cleaner, and warmer homes, fundamentally altering how they faced the cold. This development laid the groundwork for subsequent advances in heating technology, bringing us ever closer to the cozy interiors we enjoy today. Building stronger homes. The medieval period saw a gradual transformation in housing construction, particularly influenced by the desperate need to withstand brutal winters. Early medieval homes were often rudimentary, constructed of wattle and daub, timber frames, or simple stone foundations, offering limited insulation against the biting cold. The journey toward building stronger, warmer homes was slow, with improvements emerging as a result of technological, economic, and social changes. Early housing challenges. Many medieval peasants lived in small, single-room cottages that were poorly insulated. Walls made from woven sticks covered with mud and straw, thatched roofs, and dirt floors made it nearly impossible to keep interiors warm. Windows were small or non-existent, often covered with animal hides or oiled cloth instead of glass, leading to drafts and loss of precious heat. Roofs, mostly made from thatch, were vulnerable to rain and snow, often causing dampness that penetrated walls and floors. Moisture combined with cold led to a damp and unhealthy living environment, which contributed to respiratory diseases and general discomfort during long winters. The transition to stone and brick. As communities grew wealthier through trade and agriculture, and as villages and towns expanded, building materials began to change. Stone and brick construction became more common, particularly in towns and among wealthier peasants and merchants. Stone homes provided much better insulation against cold and dampness. The switch to stone was a slow process, dependent on access to materials and skilled labor. Quarrying and transporting stone was expensive and labor-intensive, but the benefits of sturdy walls that could retain heat were clear. Brick-making technology improved during the later Middle Ages, allowing for more affordable and accessible building materials in certain regions. Thicker walls and better insulation. One of the most significant advancements in building stronger homes was the construction of thicker walls. Thicker walls not only supported heavier roofs but also acted as thermal mass, absorbing heat during the day and slowly releasing it at night, reducing temperature fluctuations indoors. To further improve insulation, homes began to include multiple layers within walls, an outer stone or brick facade with an inner layer of rubble or clay mixed with straw. These composite walls helped trap heat inside, a primitive but effective form of insulation. Roofs were also improved. Tile and slate roofing gradually replaced thatch in wealthier areas, preventing water ingress and reducing dampness. Window innovations. Windows were a major source of heat loss in medieval homes. Early windows were mere openings with shutters or animal skins. The invention of glass windows was slow and expensive, so most common people had to rely on other methods. One important improvement was the use of wooden shutters that could close tightly at night to reduce drafts. In some cases, translucent materials like horn or thin slices of alabaster were used to allow light in while keeping cold air out. By the late Middle Ages, small panes of glass became more common in churches, castles, and wealthy homes, marking the beginning of a more controlled indoor environment. Interior layout changes. Stronger homes also influenced the internal layout and use of space. Instead of a single large hall where all activities occurred, wealthier homes started to develop separate rooms for different functions, such as kitchens, sleeping chambers, and storage rooms. This division helped manage heat more effectively. Cooking rooms could be heated more intensively, while bedrooms could be insulated with tapestries and wooden paneling to retain warmth. The separation of spaces also helped reduce the spread of smoke and odors within the home. Flooring and hearth placement. Flooring evolved from bare earth to stone or wooden planks, improving comfort and hygiene. Stone floors absorbed cold, so wealthier homes sometimes used rushes or straw to cover the floor and provide some insulation. The hearth, usually located centrally, was redesigned to maximize heat distribution. Fireplaces were built into walls with chimneys, as discussed earlier, to improve smoke evacuation, while allowing more efficient heating. In some homes, raised platforms with beds and benches allowed occupants to stay off cold floors at night, further protecting them from chill. Influence of feudalism and wealth distribution. The pace and extent of these housing improvements were uneven, closely tied to wealth and social status. Nobles and wealthy merchants could afford strong stone manor houses with multiple fireplaces and glass windows, while peasants often remained in rudimentary huts. Feudalism influenced this disparity, as peasants' homes were dependent on the lord's estate. Many peasants rented land and had limited resources to invest in better housing, relying on collective community efforts or incremental improvements. Towns and urban housing. In towns and cities, houses were often built close together with shared walls, which provided some insulation benefits. The rise of guilds and trades also brought skilled masons and carpenters who improved construction techniques. Townhouses began to incorporate multiple stories with storage and living areas stacked vertically, making more efficient use of limited space while improving protection from the cold. Building stronger homes was a crucial step in medieval society's fight against winter's harshness. From fragile wattle and daub huts to sturdier stone and brick houses, medieval people slowly but surely improved their living conditions through better materials, designs, and construction techniques. These changes were uneven, often reflecting social hierarchies, but they laid the foundation for more comfortable and enduring homes. Understood. I will continue writing detailed, roughly 1,000-word sections for each subheading from 10.3 through 10.10 continuously without breaks. The rise of wool trade. One of the most significant economic and social developments that improved medieval life and helped combat the brutal cold was the rise of the wool trade. Wool was the primary textile fiber used for clothing and household goods such as blankets and tapestries. Its importance cannot be overstated when considering how medieval people gradually gained better protection against the cold. Wool production and its importance. Sheep farming was a common agricultural activity throughout Europe during the Middle Ages. Wool was abundant in many regions, but early wool production was basic and often of lower quality. As demand for warmer and more durable clothing increased, techniques for processing wool improved. The entire process, from shearing sheep to carding, spinning, weaving, and dyeing, became more specialized and refined. Wool's natural insulating properties made it ideal for cold climates. Thick woolen cloaks, layered garments, and heavy blankets could trap body heat effectively, dramatically improving comfort in winter. Wool trade networks expand. As quality improved, wool became an important commodity traded across Europe and beyond. England, for example, became famous for its wool exports by the 13th and 14th centuries, supplying major textile centers in Flanders and Italy. The wool trade linked rural sheep farming regions with bustling towns and cities where skilled artisans transformed raw wool into finely woven cloth. Merchants developed complex trade routes, and the wealth generated helped fuel urban growth and technological advances. The spread of wool textiles also meant that more people could afford warm clothing, even those who were not wealthy. Peasants who once relied on rough, homemade garments began to have access to commercially produced woolen fabrics, which were often more effective in providing insulation. Economic and social impact. The wool trade's growth had broad social and economic consequences. It stimulated rural economies by creating demand for sheep and encouraged innovations in breeding and husbandry. In towns, it supported the rise of guilds that regulated quality and training in weaving and tailoring. Guilds ensured that garments met certain standards, which increased overall quality and warmth of clothing. With increased availability of wool cloth, medieval people could layer their clothing, creating multiple barriers to cold. This layering was essential during harsh winters and for outdoor work, allowing peasants and townsfolk alike to endure lower temperatures. Innovations in textile production. Alongside increased production, innovations improved wool's effectiveness in cold weather. Techniques such as fulling, where wool cloth was cleaned, thickened, and made denser, produced fabrics that resisted wind and moisture better. Dyeing with natural materials added not only color but also some protection against mold and pests. Heavier, more water-resistant woolen fabrics became common for outerwear. Knitting, though less common in the early medieval period, gradually spread and allowed the production of close-fitting woolen accessories such as socks, gloves, and hats, further improving warmth. Wool in household goods. Beyond clothing, wool was critical in making household textiles. Wool blankets and tapestries were widely used to line walls and cover beds. These textiles created a warmer indoor environment by reducing drafts and insulating walls against cold stone or timber. Tapestries served the dual purpose of decoration and insulation, hanging on castle and manor house walls to trap heat and block cold drafts. Trade brings exotic heat. The medieval period's expanding trade networks didn't just bring wool. They also introduced exotic goods and new sources of warmth and comfort that slowly transformed winter life. The arrival of new textiles. Along with wool, other textiles such as silk and cotton began arriving through trade routes connecting Europe with Asia and the Middle East. These textiles were initially luxuries but gradually influenced clothing styles and household textiles. Silk, prized for its softness and sheen, was less insulating but often lined garments that could help retain body heat. Cotton, introduced through Mediterranean trade, became increasingly common and was appreciated for its breathability. Spices and heating substances. Trade also introduced spices like cinnamon, cloves, and pepper, which had uses beyond cooking. Some spices were burned as incense or used in concoctions believed to stimulate circulation and generate internal warmth, especially during cold months. The use of heated bricks or stones, sometimes scented with herbs or spices, was a method to warm beds or rooms, influenced by knowledge exchanged along trade routes. Candles and lamps. Trade brought better quality candles made from beeswax or imported tallow. Lighting was crucial in dark, cold winters, as candles and oil lamps provided warmth as well as light. Access to better lighting extended productive hours indoors and helped create a warmer, cozier atmosphere that could ease the psychological hardship of long, dark winters. Warm drinks and recipes. As the Middle Ages progressed, culinary practices adapted to help people endure winter's chill. Warm drinks and hearty recipes became central to medieval diets during cold months. Ale, mead, and mulled wine. Ale and mead were staple beverages, providing not only hydration but warmth and calories. Served warm or mulled with spices, these drinks helped raise body temperature and were popular in winter gatherings. Mulled wine, made by heating wine with cloves, cinnamon, and citrus peels, was a festive beverage enjoyed especially during Christmas and other celebrations. Broths and stews. Slow-cooked broths and stews were common, using preserved meats, root vegetables, and grains. These dishes were nourishing and warming, providing sustained energy in cold weather. Stews were often cooked over long hours in hearths, allowing families to share warm meals that stretched ingredients and fed large groups. Herbal teas and remedies. Herbal teas made from dried plants like mint, chamomile, and thyme were used to soothe ailments and provide gentle warmth. The popularity of spiced and herbal drinks increased with the availability of imported spices and local herbs, contributing to a growing medieval understanding of food as medicine. City planning for cold. Medieval towns and cities began to reflect awareness of climate challenges, adapting urban planning to mitigate the effects of harsh winters. Narrow streets and dense building. Compact layouts with narrow, winding streets reduced exposure to harsh winds. Buildings clustered tightly together shared walls, which conserved heat. Upper stories often projected over streets, creating shelter from snow and rain and allowing residents to move about with some protection from the elements. Public hearths and baths. Public spaces with large hearths or bathhouses provided communal warmth, allowing residents to gather and escape winter's cold. Such places fostered social cohesion and offered practical relief, particularly for those without well-heated homes. Architecture of warmth. Architectural design evolved with the goal of trapping and maximizing heat inside buildings. South-facing windows and thick walls. Homes and important buildings were often oriented to maximize sunlight exposure during winter. South-facing windows allowed sunlight to warm interiors. Thicker walls and small, strategically placed windows minimized heat loss. Fireplaces and chimneys. The development of chimneys, covered in detail earlier, revolutionized heating by allowing smoke to exit without filling rooms, encouraging larger, more efficient fires. Fireplaces became focal points of homes, used not only for cooking but also for gathering and warmth. Medical understanding grows. Medieval medicine, while still rudimentary by modern standards, began to slowly incorporate ideas about cold's effects on health. The humoral theory and cold. Doctors believed that cold could imbalance the body's humors, leading to disease. Treatments included warming foods and herbs, baths, and heated stones. Herbal remedies and warming baths. Herbalists developed remedies using warming spices and plants to treat chills and respiratory illnesses. Warming baths, though limited by technology, were prescribed when possible to ease stiffness and promote circulation. Cultural changes in winter life. Over time, culture itself adapted to winter's hardships. New customs and clothing. Winter fashion became more layered and elaborate, with the use of furs, wool, and accessories to cover extremities. Social gatherings and festivals. Communities developed festivals and social rituals to lift spirits during dark months, reinforcing solidarity and resilience. How modern heating was born. The medieval struggle with winter laid foundations for modern heating systems. From hearth to stove. The evolution from open hearths to enclosed fireplaces and eventually stoves improved heating efficiency. Technological innovations. Advances in metallurgy and design in the Renaissance and beyond enabled better heat distribution. Urbanization and infrastructure. The growth of cities required centralized heating solutions, eventually leading to modern radiators and HVAC systems.